So the topic of a session I wanted to share with you is burning issues in CLIL, opinion versus research. And my presentation, I think it's quite nice that this presentation comes after David's, because David has presented a very sort of macro, interesting approach coming from different contexts and dealing with a lot of issues that go really beyond CLIL. I'm also going to be connecting CLIL with issues that are not specifically related to CLIL, but gonna be a bit more micro. So I think, you know, the two may complement each other quite nicely. Right, so in this session, I want to look at some of the opinions and myths that are created, and more, this is the case through the media, through social networks about education. Everybody has an opinion on education. Everybody has an opinion on health and medicine as well. But many of these opinions, or some of these opinions that are really shared very rapidly, you know, among millions or thousands of people, some of them are not really based on actual research and actual studies that prove that, and they create sort of well, there are statements that in the end are fact. It's our role as researchers and also teachers, practitioners, to you know, to sort of deal with them and then see to what extent these opinions and myths are really is everything okay, Maria? Because I can see, can you hear me well?
I can, yes.
Okay, perfect. No, I was just seeing that you were talking to Ana Isabel, so I thought that maybe there was a problem. All right, sorry. All right, so opinions. Okay, this is a picture from one of our journals in Spain, a very well journal, El País Semanal. Okay, this came out some years ago, where, well, this is the headline: ni bilingüe ni enseñanza, neither bilingual nor teaching. In a way, it's like bilingual education is not bilingual. Okay, we can question what do we mean by bilingual, and there's no teaching. So this is really very, say, well, a negative, hyper negative statement about bilingual education. Or headlines such as bilingüismo, bilingualism, just say no, right? And I'm going to share with you some quotes from more detailed quotes from journals and from social networks that have appeared in our context, such as, well, this is a translation: bilingual education is destructive for the subjects taught in another language, sacrificing students' understanding of a specific concepts of each discipline for the sake of language learning, as well as critical and reflexive approach to learning. In other words, bilingual education is negative for the understanding of concepts, and it's also negative, and this is related to some of the points that David was making, for critical and reflexive learning. So this idea of fluid intelligence, I think that David was referring to. Another quote: as soon as they encounter a big difficulty, so as soon as students encounter a big difficulty, they, teachers, resort to this latter language, Spanish, for a while. And this is very important, the last bit of a quote, knowing that this is the one students understand. Okay, and so these quotes here are basically related to the fact, or the question that we, you know, everybody is sort of worried about, or we can think about, teachers, researchers, learners, students, parents: is the L2 a barrier for successful learning? Meaning successful learning, the learning of language and the learning of content. Other quotes more specifically related to the context of bilingual education in Madrid has to do with the worry related to the lack of equity and maybe the possibility of students having different opportunities depending on the organization of bilingual programs. And this is the case in the bilingual education program in the Comunidad de Madrid, or this may be the case, because at school, students in a bilingual school are streamed into two different sort of types of bilingual programs. One that is called sección or section, bilingual section, where students are exposed to more hours of English and they do CLIL in a wider number of subjects, compared to what it's called programa bilingüe, where the students also do CLIL, but to a lower extent. And the way of accessing one or the other program in secondary school is related to the English competence level of the learners. They have to take an external examination in English, and based on that, and also on the recommendations by teachers regarding students' sort of capacities in general in education, not necessarily only in relation to English, are streamed into one or another. And so one question that we have to address, and I think this can be extended to other contexts, but in particular, this is the case of our bilingual education program in Madrid, is to what extent some types of CLIL or bilingual education programs may threaten equity, right? So these are issues that come up, that are discussed and are shared in newspapers, in social networks. But I think it's very, very important for us researchers and also for teachers to check and to show whether this is the case or not, and then, you know, act consequently. Right. So, well, public discourse on bilingual education then seems to involve misconceptions, and sadly, these debates sometimes hinder areas of genuine concern. And these are the two areas that I've just mentioned that I'm going to focus on, showing you some insights from the research that we have been carrying out in our research group lately, right? So the challenges and opportunities of learning in a different languages. Is it true that learning through the L2 can be so damaging for content learning and for language, maybe for learning other languages, or maybe even for the L2, the mother tongue, or, you know, first language? And also this streaming of students in different types of bilingual education groups. Right, so now I'm going to share with you some research that is related to these areas of concern that are out there and I've just presented. And the two burning issues that I will be addressing are the two that I've just highlighted. Is the L2 a barrier for successful learning? Can some types of education threaten equity? Right, and this is, well, to give you the context of our research group and the projects that we have been involved in lately. These are the acronyms: TransCLIL meaning transition, because we were very interested in the transition of students from primary school in bilingual schools in Madrid, where all the students have type and amount of CLIL, and their transition into secondary school, where in bilingual schools, as I said, students are streamed in different types of CLIL, right? Which this streaming goes beyond the actual exposure to more or fewer subjects in English, as we will try to show later. So this is the part of the TransCLIL, and then also within secondary school, we wanted to look at we wanted to compare the two types of programs, right? As I said before, across subjects, across languages. We were interested in looking at what was going on in Spanish, right? So how students were showing what they know in subjects that they had learned in English, and how can they express these meanings and this knowledge in Spanish, in their first language. And we also wanted to look at the opportunities and challenges offered when students work in CLIL when performing orally, right, and not only in interaction with the teacher, but also in other oral formats, as I will show in a minute, and also when they express what they know in writing. Okay, and the second project that we are now involved in, which is called Long at CLIL, has to do with looking at this more from a longitudinal perspective, because we were lucky to be able to follow the same students from primary school and then moving into secondary school, starting in the first year of secondary school, that is grade 7, okay, and then towards the end of secondary school, grade 10, which is really the end of bilingual programs in the Madrid autonomous community. So bachiller, upper secondary does not offer CLIL, or only as a kind of optional in sort of on a voluntary basis, let's say, but it's not part of a Comunidad de Madrid bilingual program. Right, so just to give you a little bit of a context, the data comes from the Comunidad de Madrid bilingual program, but also in our project, we also compare with parallel data from the UK, from students who were working in their own subjects in English, in their first language, or in their second language, but in English. And we also have we're carrying out comparative studies with my colleague Tarja Nikula, with parallel data from Finland. And here you have, well, just to show you the level of sort of the amount of schools participating in bilingual education programs in Madrid. At the moment, we have about 50% of all the state schools, only the state schools, public schools in Madrid are participating in a bilingual education program. Following a CLIL approach. I like to distinguish between, I mean, I like to use CLIL. I know that CLIL, you know, has evolved we by CLIL in all these years since it was coined by David and colleagues, and now I really prefer to use the term CLIL to refer to the actual approach, right? Content and language integrated learning approach, regardless of whether the program is a CLIL program, a CBI program, an immersion program, whatever we want to call it, right? But I think it's very difficult if we think of CLIL as a type of program, because programs are so different, even in the same country, right? So I'm talking of a bilingual education program in Madrid, which is different from other programs in Andalusia and other parts of Spain. Of course, they're very different from programs in other countries in Europe and beyond. Right, so this is the amount of schools involved 2 years ago. This is the latest, the most recent information I have from that. And then this is the division, the streaming into programa and so we called this too in our research project in order to make it sort of understandable for readers and colleagues from other contexts, the low exposure group and the high exposure group. And as you can see here, the students, in order to be able to participate in the high exposure group, they have to accredit an A2 level, okay, if they come from a bilingual school, and if they come from a non-bilingual school. Otherwise, they are, well, they have to sort of be, or they are streamed in the what is called low exposure group, where they have CLIL as well, right? But in a lower sort of level, not lower level, but to a lesser extent. Right, what is our sort of understanding of CLIL? You kind of studies that we've carried out. We don't see CLIL as balancing, and I must say, where we've had quite nice discussions with my colleague Roy Lister. With him, you know, I was lucky to be with in a research stay in Montreal, and we worked together. We did some research together, but we always had these discussions about, you know, the difference between integrating. I don't think it's the same, right? So, I mean, balancing has to do with, you know, sort of including more of the one or the other, depending on the characteristics of of a specific context and a specific type of subject. Obviously, you know, if we're talking about a language subject, balancing would be to include more content or some content. And if it's a content subject, balancing would be language. But for me, if we don't illustrate it in this way, in a way of looking at it as a whole, and David was talking about, you know, the fact that we don't have these two separate, let's try and understand, for example, the concept of translanguaging as not having two separate bubbles here, right? Going back to Cummins and the separate underlying proficiency versus the common underlying proficiency. In a way, this reflects this common underlying proficiency in the sense that we're not choosing one, right? So we're looking at content and language as an integrated whole. How do we do that? In our group, we have drawn on models that have helped us see language and content in an integrated manner. These are linguistic models, obviously. So we're more from the side of a language, obviously. But these are linguistic models that do not see content as something, or meanings as something separate. It's a whole, right? So it understands it. It helps us understand content as language sort of as part of a content, and also content as inseparable from language. And we found this approach to be particularly interesting or relevant for content teachers, who of course are not language teachers. Content teachers are not expected to address, you know, the fact that a student is missing a third person. Conditional that has been used is not the adequate one, right? Of course not. But language awareness, in the sense of how this language awareness helps us as content teachers approach content in a better way, and helps us students be able to express their knowledge or what they know about content in a better way, is key, right? So when we talk about language and content integration, that I'm talking about is language in that sense, right? Language as, you know, inseparable from content. And for that, we've drawn on the linguistic model of systemic functional linguistics and the ideas of genres, text types, registers. So what kind of interaction am I having? Who am I interacting with? What kind of mode? Is it spoken mode? Is it written mode? And the semantics, okay, so how can we more abstract concepts to more everyday concepts, using or languaging these concepts, you know, from abstract technical to everyday. But then we have to come back to the abstract, because otherwise students will not be able to succeed, okay, in their subjects if they express what they know in a too colloquial everyday way, right? And this is the concept, for example, of semantic waves. Right, and then also, of course, within linguistics, looking at lexicogrammar, but from this perspective, looking at lexicogrammar from a perspective of how it helps us understand and express content, right? And another sort of framework that has been very helpful in the kind of studies that we've carried out is Christiane Dalton-Puffer's concept of cognitive discourse functions, which ties in very nicely with this systemic functional approach, or this linguistic approach to content and language. And it's a kind of very interesting sort of bridge between the level of genres and texts and the level of lexicogrammar. But if we don't go to lexicogrammar, it's very difficult maybe for teachers to understand what we mean by what resources students need in order to to succeed in their subjects, and as to help their students in that respect. Okay, so in our project, and I don't want to forget mentioning my dear colleagues in who have made it possible to do this research for these many years. We have really addressed two main areas within CLIL, seeing CLIL as this, or considering CLIL this as content and language integration. For been interested in the development of students' competence for expressing academic content in the L2, in this case English, but also in Spanish. and also comparing this high exposure and low exposure group. With this, we are already addressing these ideas that we mentioned before, these opinions, right? Of, will the students be able to understand or argue or explore if content is taught in a second language? This worry that I was mentioning before. And also, is there other issues of equity or inequity rather that can be involved in this kind of programs where students are streamed, right, in different types of CLIL? They all have CLIL, so in a way it should be good news. But what happens, in that school with these two groups, and how do teachers approach this? And the other area that we were interested in was going into the classroom practices. We've always, for all these years of research in our group, we have been lucky to be given access to the classroom and be able to really, observe what is going on in classroom, focusing specifically on classroom interaction. And here we were particularly interested in whether we could observe different interactional practices, different groups, right, in the high exposure and the low exposure group. To what extent students in these two different groups are engaged similarly, to what extent they're challenged, and David talked about that before, to what extent they're challenged enough, right, in these two different groups, and similarly in this, or differently in these two groups. And then the other aspect that we looked at was participant perspectives, and we've carried out of students and teachers' beliefs and approaches to this idea of integration, not so much motivation towards English. Many studies have been carried out in bilingual and non-bilingual groups looking at their motivation or focusing on students' motivation towards English. We were interested in their motivation towards this CLIL approach, right? But this in blue is an area that I'm not going to specifically focus on today, right? I'm going to address the other two areas, academic language performance, classroom practices, because they're more related to these burning issues that I mentioned before that I wanted to address here with you. Right. These are the two questions that I will try to address with you here today. And for the part of is the L2 a barrier for successful learning, meaning learning in, how students are able to express meanings that they are expected to express in a particular subject and for a particular specific prompt, a particular specific genre and specific task. And I'm going to focus on two of Christiane Dalton-Puffer's cognitive discourse functions, the use of definitions, okay, which is something that students are expecting. So yes, this is the first issue that I wanted to address with you today. We have just published part of the study that we carried out on definitions, and you have a reference there in case you're interested. But please email if you want some more details and you want to discuss anything of what I say here. But just in case you want to read some part of these results I will be presenting. And as I said, for us, the concept of CDFs, cognitive discourse functions, is a bridge between the level of texts, the level of genres in different subjects, and the actual level of a lexicogrammar. So what is the language that students need for this particular genre, for this particular text? And as I said, today I'm going to address specifically some results that we obtained from students' attempts to define concepts, right? And also a little bit on how they explore. If we think of cognitive discourse functions and a framework of cognitive discourse functions in relation to the well-known Bloom's taxonomy and the recent version by Anderson and Krathwohl, really what we're doing with define, we're looking at more lower order thinking skills, and in the case of explore, more towards the sort of higher order thinking skills. Right, this is the prompt. I can't get into details about how we collected the data, but just to give you an idea, prompt that the students received, okay, and this was in this case primary school students in grade 6. We tried with this to sort of in collaboration with the teachers, and the choice of a topic was done with them, of course, in order to sort of choose a topic that the students had just studied and that they felt that they were interested in, that the students were interested in. And we tried to elicit the different cognitive discourse functions. For example, the topic was ecosystems, and this was a definition that they had in their textbook that teachers expected them to define, okay, that they show what they know about what an ecosystem is. And also the question that is related to the function of explore: what will be the effects to the ecosystem if an animal that they had to invent, right, was introduced ecosystem? So this is a question that is related to the cognitive discourse function of explore, because it's not something that the students already had worked with the teachers in class, but they were asked to go further and imagine what they thought the effects of the ecosystem would be, the effects of introducing a new animal in that particular location would have on the ecosystem. And we were very interested in looking at in English and also in the Spanish, taking into account that they had learned this subject only in English, okay? Because of this idea of, you know, this opinion, this myth that when students learn subjects in English, the students in bilingual education may miss the understanding, and also we saw the exploring of ideas of learning the foreign language or the second language or the additional language. And we were also interested in looking at the different modes and see what are the different things happening there. Right, so definitions, of course, we needed to know in order to be able to see what the students were doing. We needed to have a framework that allowed us to see what type of definitions are out there. And of course, definitions can be very canonical, such as the one above. An ecosystem is a community where the term is followed by the class, a community. An ecosystem is a community, and then there are expansions, right? Classifications, exemplifications, etc. And this we found that tended to happen more often in the written performance of a student, because I didn't mention this before, but after the students wrote about this topic, responding to the different parts of a prompt, as I showed earlier on, we then carried out individual interviews with the students. The students were in pairs, and we interacted with them on these very same topics, but orally, right? So we wanted to see what kind of limitations and what kind of opportunities written and oral performances were offering these students in terms of these cognitive discourse functions, right? Example, spoken definitions often did not include the class, right? So this is not a canonical definition. And well, maybe teachers would expect the students to use the class. In terms of a distinction or comparison across subjects, and we compared science, biology, and social science, okay, we found that there are differences, that students use more formal definitions in history, more semi-formal without use of class in science. And we found that this was also the case in what we found in textbooks, right? So it is obvious that the students were doing what they were sort of seeing in the materials that they were working on, but there are differences. So we cannot expect that when students learn how to define in the way that is expected by teachers in one subject, then they learn how to do it in another subject, okay? So there are differences. In the comparisons between their performance in writing and their performance orally, we also found differences. As I said before, there are more formal definitions when they write and more semi-formal when they speak. But interestingly, they used more expansions when they spoke. They added more information to what they knew about ecosystems when they spoke. In other words, they were showing there that more things that they knew about the term of ecosystems. They were given the opportunity, they felt they had the opportunity to show with expansions, with extensions, more about the term ecosystem, that of course is allowing teachers to see, how much the students understand this concept. So less formal, yes, in the oral language, but with more details, right? With more information. So different modes are offering us different sort of perspectives of what the students know about the topic. And interestingly for us, there were no differences across modes. In other words, although the students has studied biology and history in English, when they were asked to define these terms in Spanish, they used either formal or informal definitions. In both cases, they used expansions or not in both cases. Those students that defined more canonically in English, also more canonically in Spanish compared to other students who maybe produced definitions that were not so accurate or that missed information. Just some examples to show what we found also in terms of this difference across languages, right? Sorry, first of all, across fields in the cognitive discourse function of explore. Well, we found that in both subjects, the main struggle was with the use of, the verb forms in order to express hypotheses, right? So this is what I was saying before about the conditional, right? So content teachers, CLIL teachers, content CLIL teachers are not expected to teach the conditionals, but the conditionals have an effect on what the students, on students' expression of what they know, and particularly this is the case in the case of a cognitive discourse function of explore. But interestingly, this also happened in Spanish. In Spanish, the students also struggled when they were creating this hypothesis about the future. Si no estuviéramos cuidando el medio ambiente hace tiempo, no estuviéramos ahora viviendo. So this no estuviéramos, okay, the message is understood, but they're struggling with how to sort of deliver this content. And we know that the way we express content has an effect on how our knowledge of this content is valued by teachers. So we didn't find differences across languages. There were different types of definitions, but there were not different across languages. There are differences across fields. There are differences in the way students defined, for example, in the case of definition, orally or in writing. So this tells us that to what extent that language, the fact that it's English or Spanish, plays a big role in our view, drawing on these results. The important thing is to work on these models that allow us to help students to express their meanings properly in whatever language. Of course, then they need the labels, they need the vocabulary to be able to express them in another language. But as Kamin said, the transferability from one language to another is related to the core strategies, right? And in this case, we're talking about this cognitive discourse functions and the core characteristics of a definition or an exploration. Disciplines are different, so we need to distinguish across disciplines. There are no solutions that are equal for everybody, for all disciplines. And then very important to enhance students' productions, not only in writing, also in speaking, in different modes, right? In the classroom interaction, in groups with their peers, as David was mentioning before, it is quite already proof that the students learn more from their peers than from in many cases than from teachers. So create different scenarios, oral, written, for the students' expression of what they know. In terms of classroom practices, this is more related to this issue of equity or inequity, because in this study that I carried out with my colleague Natalia Vnitskaya, and this has just been published as well in TESOL Quarterly, we wanted to look at whether the same teachers teaching this high exposure group and the low exposure group showed different interactional practices. We were lucky to be able to follow different sessions from two teachers. One is a science teacher who teaches in English in the high exposure group section and in Spanish in the low exposure group. The other one is a technology teacher who teaches in English in both groups, because remember, technology was one of the subjects that was taught in English in both groups. Right. So if you look at these pie charts, you can see that the ones at the top are very similar. The ones at the bottom are relatively similar to, in terms of a color distribution, to the ones at the top, but there's slightly difference between the top row and the bottom one. Basically, we found that in terms of the time that the teachers devoted to talking with the content, which is instructional register, increased this distinction of different types of classroom registers. The time that teachers and students devoted to organizing tasks and activities, and the task that teachers and students devoted to social talk, which had nothing to do with the actual content being talked about or the actual organization of the classroom activity, is pretty similar, right? And we find the same teacher, right, uses a similar kind of register distribution in the high exposure group and the low exposure group, and the science teacher the same, right? So it seems that there are similarities in the type of registers that they use. So we didn't find any differences there. We were interested in the use of interpersonal language through the use of appraisal. And yes, we found some differences. We found that in the low exposure groups, there was more use of attitude, so feelings, emotions, judgments. Teachers judged more what the students were doing, so that involves corrections and corrective feedback. And in the case of the high exposure group, there was more engagement, there was more opinion sharing, there was more exploration. So we are seeing some differences there. We also looked at the pedagogy, comparing what the teachers were doing in terms of how they distributed the same topic in both groups, right? It was the same topic and the same units, right, that they were presenting in one group or another. So basically, very similar distribution. The main pedagogical purposes that we found were setting up the activity, monitoring the activity, and introducing content. So introducing content, both teachers spent an important part of the lessons in this, taking the whole unit, right, in introducing content. So we were interested in how they introduced content. And there we saw some differences, right? The content was co-constructed in both cases, which was good news, right? So it wasn't the teacher delivering content, but it was co-constructed with the student. But if we looked at how content was co-constructed with the students, there is where we find some differences. Because in the high exposure group, right, the teachers mainly, although the percentages were similar, but they used quite a lot of exploring students' views. And this was a bit less, and the higher percentage, the highest percentage of this co-construction with the low exposure group was with checking students' previous knowledge. So more exploring and more checking, right, in the traditional way. The technology class was more exploring in all cases, but if there was some checking, it was in the case of a low exposure group. I'm going to show you some examples that illustrate the kind of interaction that was going on there. And of course, this kind of interaction has an effect on the kind of interpersonal resources, the kind of appraisal resources, interpersonal language that the students were using. And you see these colors, attitude, engagement, graduation, and we see that there is barely, there is but not much more. So this is what they were doing. The teacher was doing, the same teacher was doing in the low exposure group. What messages have appeared there? They were talking about a video, right? And then the student responds that 68% of our body is water, 60%, 70% of our planet is water. So it's quite factual in sense of, you know, what did you see in the video? What are the facts? in the case of a high exposure group, talking about the same video, this is what happened. Which of the messages are saying you think is the most important? You think is the most important. So here we have appraisal, you think the most important. And the student answers that without water we cannot live. We couldn't live, we couldn't be alive. Any other ideas? We couldn't live with polluted water because it's a unique substance. It's a unique substance, that's for they don't. So there is exploring there. There is going beyond what they actually saw in the video. So more fostering of HOTS, higher order thinking skills. It's clear that different pedagogical purposes trigger different types of also cognitive discourse functions, and also the use of interpersonal language. The use of interpersonal language also triggers the use of, in the case of engagement, modal verbs, modal expressions. So they use actual language resources, grammatical to express these meanings. And we saw that higher order thinking skills were more enhanced in the high exposure group. And so a more academic sort of, or more, there were more expectations from a lower exposure, from a high exposure group. And so definitely we have some ideas there. Of course, more research has to be done, carried out. There are more expectations from a higher, high exposure group in terms of higher academic level. Remember that the science was taught in Spanish in the low exposure group. So it's not a question of language difficulty. It's a question of what the teacher seems to be expecting from the learners who are streamed in different groups. So just to wrap up, and coming back to these quotes that I used before, bilingual education for subjects taught in another language, sacrificing students' understanding, and we think of understanding measured through how students define the concepts that they've learned, and also destructive for critical and reflective approach. We can think of a way students in our example here were exploring about the possible effects of including an animal in an ecosystem. Well, really, we were seeing that the advantages were not related to the fact that the L2 was used, but we saw both opportunities and challenges in both languages, also in their first language. And the second quote that was related to the possible issues of equity. The second quote here is related to the first issue as well, knowing that this is the one students understand, the first language. Well, from what we've seen, as I just mentioned, we find similar issues in English and in Spanish. And the second worry about possible differences created in some bilingual education programs. Well, yes, I mean, we find that, as we saw in the surface, if we look at what teachers were doing in these different groups, teaching the same topic, it seems similar, but if you dig deeper, there are some differences. And I think more studies like this need to be carried out, and also conversations with teachers, because in a conversation with one of these teachers, she said, well, yes, I tried to I think I tried to control more the low exposure group because there are more issues of behavior and so on, but I hadn't thought about such detail. And it was quite a, kind of interesting to sort of have this discussion with her about it, and sort of awareness of things that maybe are done, and we don't think that, I mean, we as teachers, we do things that we don't think we do until we see and talk to others about it. So yes, just to conclude, we found that this is not necessarily the case, at least in our study. Yes, in the case of our studies. So we need to really be more careful about, trying to sort of take this information that we receive from the media with caution, and then, specialists, researchers, and mainly teachers can sort of look at this with critical eyes, and then see, what is really problematic in their own context, because of here we're talking about different contexts, and also share with others and try to come up with solutions. So thank you very much. I'm